Welcome to the Language Stories podcast, where I include extra stories about the history of languages. Before we start, I want to remind you to press subscribe and click on the bell to get notified when a new video is released. In this episode, we'll start once again with the story of King Alfred the Great and continue with the stories of Middle English, Early Modern English, American English, and the story of the oldest English epic poem. Story 1. Alfred the Great and English Writing. Who was the earliest English king you can name? Well, this story is about a king who is featured in many English legends. No, not King Arthur, but a real historical figure named King Alfred the Great. A weak and sickly child with 3 older brothers, Alfred was an unlikely king. Alfred frequently suffered from episodes of intense stomach pains. Sometimes it was so severe that it made him unable to leave his room for days or even weeks at a time. Because of this, Alfred was more interested in books than the military arts from an early age. In fact, Alfred won a beautifully decorated book of English poetry, offered as a prize by his mother to the first of her sons able to memorize it. The young Alfred, when visiting Rome with his father, also impressed Pope Leo IV, who named Alfred a consul of Wessex. However, Alfred remained illiterate until the age of 12 because his father, King Beowulf of Wessex, had arranged for him to be schooled in the military arts. As the 4th son of the king, Alfred kept a low profile during the reign of his 2 eldest brothers. However, he was known to be a philanderer during his teenage years. Alfred's public life began in 865 at age 16 with the accession of his 3rd brother, 18-year-old Alfred. During this period, Bishop Asser gave Alfred the unique title of Secundarius, a recognized successor closely associated with the reigning monarch. Alfred fought the Vikings alongside Alfred until Alfred died from his injuries in 871, when Alfred was 22. Alfred then succeeded his brother onto the throne. After years of fighting, the young King Alfred won a decisive victory against the Danish Vikings in 878 AD. In 886, Alfred recaptured London and became king of the Anglo-Saxons. With the war over, Alfred noticed and regretted the great loss of knowledge that had resulted from the Viking destruction of the monasteries and the subsequent fall in literacy rates. He believed that all English freemen should be literate, and that the clergy should be schooled in Latin. He imported scholars from overseas and set up a school at court. At the time, there were few books of wisdom written in English. Alfred sought to remedy this through an ambitious court-centered program of translating into English the books he deemed most necessary for all men to know. This made Alfred the first English king to write books. The English that would have been spoken in Alfred's time would have been Old English, or the Anglo-Saxon language. To our ears, Old English might sound more akin to German due to their Saxon ancestry, or Norse due to the Viking conquests, than the English we speak today. Here is an excerpt of Alfred's preface to his translation of Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care. Avundrade ich swede thara godena wiotena the you weran beyond anger kun. And the betch erla befulan yelior not hafton. That here hiora tha nan dal nolden on hiora ayen yet bio de wendon. For the may think better, that where eat sume betch. That then yet bether fosta, sien eram monum to weotona. So Alfred promoted education in his kingdom and provided patronage to the arts. His reign remained peaceful thereafter till 890 AD, when large-scale Danish invasions arrived once more. Alfred is credited with administrative, legal, and tax reforms. He also reorganized the military to make it more effective. Alfred had a keen eye for posterity, what people in the future would think about him. So before passing in 899 at the age of 50, He asked Bishop Asser to write his biography and start the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Alfred likely died from complications from a stomach illness, most likely Crohn's disease. Alfred's sense of history and his own historic destiny were fundamental to the development of the English monarchy. His reforms helped to transform the society in which he lived and laid the foundations of the English state. His grandson, Athelstan, building on Alfred's successes, was recognized as the king of all Britain. And if it weren't for King Alfred, we'd probably have less Old English manuscripts than we have today. Story 2. Wycliffe and the Middle English Bible. What exactly is Middle English? Well, in 1066, the Norman invasion of England brought in the Old Norman dialect of Old French. A significant number of words of French origin began to appear in the English language, such as pork, beef, veal, mutton, forest, mansion, and liberty. Anglo-Norman became the language of the English nobility, while the conquered Saxons mostly retained their Old English dialects. This led to a rather diverse set of dialects during the medieval times. The English London dialect and the Scots language also diverged in this time. John Wycliffe was a man who streamlined the many English dialects into a common dialect through the clarity and popularity of his writings and sermons. One of his most important and boldest contributions was the first full English translation of the Bible. Wycliffe was born around 1330 in Yorkshire, England. The family from which he came was of early Saxon origin, long settled in Yorkshire. It became extinct in the first half of the 19th century, remaining true to the Church of Rome until the end. But in his day, the family was a large one. His childhood and youth fell into a period when England was winning increasing regard abroad, and when the ecclesiastical political position of the land was marked by a leadership which did not seem likely to diminish. Wycliffe probably received his early training in the neighborhood of his home. Later on, he was a Bible study student and then a theology teacher at Oxford University. In 1374, he became rector of Lutterworth in Leicestershire. Wycliffe opposed the Pope's claim to the right to tax and to appoint men to church offices without asking the king. In 1377, he was brought to trial before the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London, but a crowd of his London supporters came to his rescue. Wycliffe also fought for the everyman. At that time, people mainly heard the Bible at church, since they did not know how to read Latin, and the Bible was costly. This frustrated Wycliffe, so he started his own translation, ignoring the long-held belief that no person should translate the Bible on their own initiative, without approval of the church. Wycliffe believed that studying the Bible and building a personal relationship with God was more important than listening to it read by the clergy. Wycliffe and his followers together completed the English translation. There are two distinct versions of Wycliffe's Bible that have been written. The earlier was translated during the life of Wycliffe in 1384, while the later version from the 1390s is regarded as the work of John Purvey. The earlier translation is also a more rigid translation of the Latin Vulgate Bible. Here is Luke 8, verses 1 to 3 from the earlier translation. And it was done afterward, and Jesu made journey by cities and castells, preaching and evangelizing the room of God, and 12 with him, and some women that weren healed of wicked spirits and sicknesses, Marie that is cleped Magdalene, of whom 7 devils wenten out, and Joan the wife of Chusa, procurator of Herod, and Susanna, and many other which ministered unto him of her riches. In response to the translation and Wycliffe's criticisms, the Pope issued papal decrees against him, and his teachings were condemned at Oxford. But Wycliffe continued to preach fearlessly, and he wrote many Latin treatises to support his attacks on the beliefs and practices of the Church. Wycliffe also had the support of the nobles, allegedly including John of Gaunt, as long as he denounced rich churchmen. But he began to teach that lordship and property were held only by God's grace and were forfeited if the owners fell into mortal sin. These teachings helped bring on the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 and lost Wycliffe the support of the nobles. In 1384, Wycliffe died in his parish of Lutterworth. Today, more than 250 manuscripts of the Wycliffe Bible survive, and Wycliffe is seen as one of the first reformers, inspiring Bohemian reformer Jan Hus, who in turn influenced Martin Luther. On the linguistic side of things, Wycliffe raised Middle English prose to a footing closer on par with Latin and French, and formed a standard language accessible to the English people. Therefore, Wycliffe is called the father of English prose, because his works in the Middle English dialect did much to shape our language today. Story 3. Malory, Reformation, and Shakespeare. The English of Shakespearean plays is often called Old English by struggling students, but Shakespeare actually wrote in what linguists call Early Modern English. This story will be a little different in that I will focus on 3 influential works during this period. There are many Arthurian legends and even more versions of these legends. But one man, whom we only know as Sir Thomas Malory, compiled, rearranged, and interpreted and modified material from various French and English sources to write the prose novel Le Mort d'Arthur. The title of the book is Middle French for The Death of Arthur. The book is one of the earliest printed books in England, first published in 1485, and today this is one of the best-known works of Arthurian literature. Perhaps Malory had intended to set down a unified Arthuriad in England, and he more or less succeeded, as many 19th century revival writers used Le Mort d'Arthur as their source. The novel itself had 3 main motifs: Lancelot and Guinevere's affair, the long blood feud between the families of King Lot and King Pellinore, and the Grail quest. Each motif shows how Arthur's failures in love, loyalty, and religion contributed to his downfall. Here is a quote from the novel where Arthur talks of his love of Guinevere to his friend Merlin. "I love Guinevere, the king's daughter of Lodogrian, of the land of Camilerde, the which holdeth in his house the table round that ye told me had hit of my father Uther. And this damosel is the most valiant and fairest that I know living, or yet that ever I could find." "Certes," said Merlion, "as of her beauty and fairness, she is one of the fairest on live. But, and ye loved her not as well as ye do, I should find you a damosel of beauty and of goodness that should like you and please you, and your heart were not set. But there as man is heart is set, he will be loth to return." End quote from Book 1 of Le Mort d'Arthur. Other than being one of the first printed English books, Le Mort d'Arthur also fits comfortably between Middle and Early Modern English, with a little French mixed in. Another key influence on the formation of modern English was the first Book of Common Prayer, written under the supervision of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer after Henry VIII ordered a separation from the Catholic Church. Some have argued that since attendance at prayer book services was required by law for many years, the repetitive use of its language helped to standardize modern English even more than the later King James Bible, published in 1611, did. The book itself was finalized in 1552 during the reign of King Edward VI. The book came under threat after the Catholic Mary I succeeded her brother, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was actually executed during her reign. However, the Book of Common Prayer returned to use after Elizabeth I took the throne. Here is an excerpt from the preface of the book. There was never anything by the wit of man so well devised, or so surely established, which in continuance of time hath not been corrupted. As among other things, it may plainly appear by the common prayers in the Church, commonly called divine service, the first original and ground whereof. If a man would search out by the ancient fathers, he shall find that the same was not ordained, but of a good purpose, and for a great advancement of godliness. End quote. Of course, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer has undergone many revisions and updates, and today local variations are used in churches around or deriving from the Anglican Communion in over 50 different countries and in over 150 different languages. And now we return to the topic of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's plays are a canon of approximately 39 dramatic works. The traditional division of his plays into tragedies, comedies, and histories follows the categories used in the first folio that was published in 1623. The first folio was published posthumously, as Shakespeare, or whoever was truly behind that name, was an active playwright from circa 1590 to circa 1612. No matter your opinion about Shakespeare or his plays, his influence extends from theater and literature to present-day movies, Western philosophy, and the English language itself. I'll conclude with an excerpt from Shakespeare's Richard II, Act 2, Scene 1, with lines spoken by John of Gaunt about his love for his country. This royal throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. Story 4. The United States of America's first dictionary. The American-British split in the English language is dated around 1725. The American colonies were already diverse in dialect among themselves, but the starkest difference spanned across the Atlantic Ocean, or the pond, as we like to say today. While most of the split was a natural evolution of language, there was a man who set out to distinguish American English from British English. Noah Webster was born in West Hartford, Connecticut in 1758. He came of age during the American Revolution of the 1770s and was a strong advocate of the Constitutional Convention. He believed wholeheartedly in the developing cultural independence of the United States, a chief part of which was the distinctive American language with its own idioms, pronunciation, and style. In 1806, Webster published a compendious dictionary of the English language. This dictionary actually wasn't the first one by an American and published in the States. That title actually belongs to Samuel Johnson Jr., whose dictionary was published in 1798. However, Webster's dictionary had a huge cultural impact. This book is where the spelling differences were standardized. For example, Webster changed the CE in words like defense, offense, and pretense to SE. He also abandoned the second silent L in verbs such as travel and cancel when forming the past tense, dropped the U from words such as humor and color, and drops the K from words such as public and music. Webster went on to write his magnum opus, an American Dictionary of the English Language, published in 1828. The dictionary contained over 70,000 entries. In both dictionaries, Webster documented distinctively American vocabulary such as skunk, hickory, and chowder. However, his innovations weren't always accepted. No one accepted the change in spelling of tongue to T-U-N-G. A discussion of Americanisms can't continue without addressing the Native American influence. Of course, Native Americans, or the indigenous peoples of America, were a diverse group of many tribes in different geographical regions. So a language that was already an amalgamation of Anglo-Saxon, Old Norse, Old Norman, and more, now had more loanwords from the indigenous American languages. Many of these words specifically came from the Algonquian languages of the eastern coastal tribes. These words are caribou, caucus, chipmunk, hickory, muskrat, opossum, persimmon, raccoon, skunk, squash, and many more. Returning to Webster, he did have a competitor, Joseph Emerson Wooster. Wooster accused Webster of plagiarism in the etymology entries. His dictionaries also focused more on traditional pronunciation and spelling instead of Americanizing them like Webster did. The Wooster-Webster rivalry became known as the Dictionary Wars. The rivalry continued after Webster's death, but ended with Wooster's death in 1865. Clearly, Webster won the Dictionary Wars as Wooster's dictionary revisions were discontinued, and the book eventually went out of print. Moreover, while Webster was promoting his dictionary, George and Charles Merriam opened the G&C Merriam Company, a printing and book-selling operation, in 1831. The Merriam brothers eventually bought unsold copies of the 1841 edition of Webster's dictionary, and secured the rights to create revised editions of that work. Thus, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary was born. Story 5. Discovery of the Beowulf manuscript. In the private library of Elizabethan physician and antiquarian Sir Robert Cotton sat the oldest known work of English literature. The poem was on a manuscript with 4 other works, and the manuscript itself was on a shelf with a bust of Vitellius. The manuscript is estimated to date from around 975 to 1025 AD, and it is the only medieval copy of the epic poem. The poem I speak of is known as Beowulf, a work written in Old English. Beowulf was bound together with 4 other works in Old English, 3 in prose, the Passion of St. Christopher, the Wonders of the East, and Alexander's letter to Aristotle, and Judith, a poem. Judith and Beowulf are composed in the unrhymed 4-beat alliterative style characteristic of Old English poetry, and are among the earliest wholly vernacular works in the English canon. The whereabouts of the manuscript during the 500 years after it was written is a mystery. We only know that the Dean of Lichfield, Lawrence Noel, owned it at least long enough to write his name and the date on the first page in 1563. It is likely that Noel salvaged the manuscript from the destruction ordered by Henry VIII, who dissolved the monasteries and broke up their libraries. From Noel, the manuscript ended up in the hands of Sir Robert Cotton, then came under the protection of the Crown upon Cotton's death. Miraculously, the codex containing Beowulf survived a fire in the Cotton Library in 1731, and while the manuscript was damaged, Icelandic linguist and antiquarian Grimmer Johnson Thorkelin had transcribed the poem before the fire, so his copies preserved evidence of now missing or faded words. So the story of this codex is one of several happy chances. Someone recorded the likely orally passed down poem onto a manuscript. Then a dean saved it from the destruction of the English Reformation. Then it came under the Crown's protection. Then an Icelandic linguist transcribed copies, and now we have a rather complete Old English epic poem. But what is this epic poem about? Well, the 3,182-line poem is set in Scandinavia in the 6th century. Beowulf, a hero of the Geats, comes to the aid of Hrothgar, the king of the Danes, whose mead hall in Heorot has been under attack by a monster known as Grendel. After Beowulf slays him, Grendel's mother attacks the hall and is then also defeated. Victorious, Beowulf goes home to Geatland, Gotaland in modern Sweden, and becomes king of the Geats. 50 years later, Beowulf defeats a dragon, but is mortally wounded in the battle. After his death, his attendants cremate his body and erect a tower on a headland in his memory. I will now read the last 10 lines of this epic poem, where the Geats mourn Beowulf's death and await their own extermination. Todan Earlship on his Ellen work, de gudum demdon swahit edifu bid, that mon his winne druten wordum herg, verthum freya, thon hefarth skille of lichaman ladded wertha, swa begnornadon gerta leode, plafordus her, herth bieniatas, quadan that her wer de kuninga, mana mildust on the month whereast, leodum lithust on the lof yeonos. Why the poem with a Scandinavian hero exists in Old English at all is a mystery, since Scandinavian raiders had been ravaging English shores for 2 centuries by the time the manuscript was being copied. However, a poem featuring a Scandinavian hero may have been able to flourish at the court of King Canute, who added England to his Danish Empire in 1016. Another mystery is that the poem recorded in a Christianized England contains only Old Testament references, no references to Christ, in a story about pagan characters. Any of these issues, from the perilous history of the single manuscript to the uncertainties of oral transmission from audience to audience, to the use of a pagan foreign hero in medieval Christian England, could have prevented the manuscript from enduring. And yet, Beowulf was still read and served as an inspiration. Perhaps it is because the poem contains many themes that reach the core of what we understand about ourselves. The tales of human struggle, of good versus evil, of the strength of sinew, heart and spirit, truth and light, pitted against a dark power that gives no quarter as it shifts from shape to shape. From start to finish, Beowulf demands our acknowledgement that sorting out the monster from the hero and the coward is a lifetime struggle in the dark. Thank you for listening. This is the end of episode 2, Origins of English, of the Language Stories podcast. Check out the video version of the story of Alfred the Great on my YouTube channel, multilangproject. Next episode will be about Latin across the ages. Until next time, stay safe and take care, my fellow multilinguals.